Thanks everyone for tuning in to check out our podcast today, Maker Connect. My name is Matt Despins, and I'll be your host for the show. With me today, we have Paul Voisard, who's a founding partner here at the firm. And also today, we have our guest, Andrew Morton. Andrew is currently the Chief Revenue Officer at User Voice, and no doubt has some stories, expertise, and opinions to share. Andrew, if you're open to it, I'd love to start by asking you to tell us just a little bit about your career and your background so the listeners can get just a flavor of your negotiation experience. Also, maybe you can let us know at what point in your career did you discover the importance of negotiations and start to actually take it seriously. So, Andrew, we're extremely excited to have you here with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to brag about yourself for a minute. And by the way, it is the host who's making a specific request that you brag, so your humility will remain intact, sir. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. And thank you, Paul. Thank you both for having me. Humility, I can stick with that. It may be a little tough. I'm going to try not to go too hard on bragging about myself.
Please
but
do.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think, so if I think about my career path and sort of the influence that it's had on my negotiation process or vice versa, I've had a very non-traditional path. I grew up in and around the hospitality industry. I thought for the longest time I was going to do hotel operations, hotel management, and actually ended up changing paths. But really, the origination of my career, my professional development, started around customer experience and empathy. And I highlight that because, as you both know, that's such a critical component of any good negotiation process. And I won't get into that now, but what I'm really grateful for is like having that start, because I think it allowed me to build a skill set, really hone my EQ, my ability to build empathy and really listen and understand a customer. And then as I've kind of gone on, as I mentioned, I followed this sort of nonlinear path and had the opportunity to work in different capacities and different negotiations. So I went through hospitality kind of as my origination, ended up in transportation and logistics, managing large fleet operations, large customer organizations, anywhere from $5 million in ARR all the way up to 75, 80, $90 million in ARR. So
wow.
a broad breadth. But really, again, I'm grateful for that opportunity because I had the chance to interact with different partners. As I'm sure you all know, when you're interacting or you're sort of managing heavy logistical operations, there's vendors, there's delivery partners, there's unions that are involved with that. And so I got exposure to a lot of different types of conversations, a lot of different interactions, a lot of different negotiation processes. Again, all the way from I'm trying to negotiate with a vendor to give me a better price, all the way to I have to figure out what my relationship with a union is going to look like for the next 5 years, and how that's going to work and how we're going to optimize it for both parties. And through that career, I ended up really getting heavily involved with SaaS software in general, and kind of made that transition pretty naturally. And again, I think what's been great is just sort of that diverse background, although it's maybe strange in some ways or non-traditional for somebody in my position, really exposed me to a lot of different different applications of negotiations and commercial relationships. And it's allowed me to take that and really build great, effective teams of negotiators. I won't say we're perfect and we're always learning, but I feel like a lot of times, going back to I'm going to brag a little bit, I feel like I've got a little bit of a leg up when it comes to, competing against other sellers in a SaaS space, because I've just seen such a broad spectrum of different types of negotiation tactics and processes that it's very rare that I get caught off guard with something these days, to be quite honest. So that's kind of my background. I've been at User Voice for 2 years, started as a VP of sales, moved to the Chief Revenue Officer position about 1.5 years ago, and been cranking ever since.
Yeah, I mean, like you pointed out, the depth of your background is really impressive. I mean, talking about relationships, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, but I mean, those unions, right? I mean, everything that's all about long-term relationships and making sure you're laying the right foundations of trust, because you can't do anything if you don't have it with those groups. One thing I want to bring our attention back to that you talked about, because it's very closely aligned with our maker framework that Paul and our other founder developed is empathy. In fact, I've done some other content surrounding that. That speaks to me personally a little bit. My background before here was working in mental health, and so before we talk and hear some of Paul's thoughts on this, I want to dive into that and say, where do you think that empathy developed from with you? In terms of like, was it a personal thing? Was it things you experienced at work? And the second part of that two-part question would be, how do you typically utilize that in your day-to-day negotiations, like to create those better relationships?
Yeah, so I think that from my perspective, that originated. I kind of go again back to the hospitality background, and I think about sort of, oftentimes it's really easy when you are dealing with a difficult customer in any industry, but particularly in hospitality, where you're just like, oh, this is a cranky customer, or they're crazy, or you just make all these assumptions. But the reality is if you are good at your job, you actually just you shut up and you listen, right? And you understand their perspective and where they're coming from, because oftentimes it's not the challenge or the frustration is not associated to you or what you're delivering. It's this context of all these other circumstances that are happening around, right? That you're not in control of, but that you have to deal with. And so sort of setting that expectation as like, look, this isn't ever a personal thing. This is something that I need to help work through. I need to understand this partner's perspective. I need to understand why they're doing that. I think that was really helpful. I had an opportunity as well, just as a kind of an aside note, to go through a lengthy diversity and inclusion training for
Yep.
12 months when I was in my mid to late 20s. And that really, I think, also helped reinforce the importance of understanding different perspectives and where people come from. And, I think so often we get isolated in these views of like, everybody thinks the same way I do or sees things the same way I do. And more so gets frustrated. Well, why don't you see these things the same way? Or I see this as equitable and you don't. And so I was really fortunate to be able to partake in some of that training, which was very, very valuable to me. And so when we're doing negotiations today in my current role, or whether it's in my personal life, I know this sounds very cliche or very obvious, but I'm always trying to think about, what are the circumstances that other person is dealing with, right? Like, so if I'm talking to a prospect, I need to consider, okay, well, they have goals and objectives that they have to meet. They have a boss who's pressuring them to get, this right or nail this project. They've got a finance team who's hammering about a budget. And so oftentimes, like, although we may feel frustrated with a particular person, it's really these additional circumstances that are completely out of not just my control, but their control, right? So I'm trying to go into any conversation in general with like, well, what can I do to help make your life easier, right? Because I know you have to compete with all this other stuff on the back end and you're trying to work through it, just like I have the same stuff on my end. And I think ultimately that makes you more relatable and you build more trust when you approach conversations that way.
Yeah, there's that empathy, and unknowingly, we're going to turn over to Paul here for a minute, but you touched on a lot of things that are really core tenets of kind of what we talk about at the Maker Group in terms of. So, Paul, he talked about removing emotion, not making it personal, understanding that when somebody is maybe coming at us a little bit aggressively, that it's typically about things going on in their own lives, not so much about us. So can you talk a bit about makers' ideas and perceptions when it comes to kind of isolating those emotions, not making it personal?
Yeah, a lot of what you said did in fact resonate.
It was spot on.
I teed up my life experience for you, Paul. I was just, this is led me to this conversation.
Like you read our book.
Exactly.
No, but I want to focus in on a few things that you said there. One being one of the most important things that people forget in negotiations is what you just said there about perspective. It's people get so caught up in their own heads when they're in a negotiation. They get so worried about all the things that they need to have happen, right? You're worried about what your boss is going to think. You're worried about what's going to happen to your numbers for the quarter. What's going to happen. Am I going to hit my bonus? Is my boss going to fire me? Right? If I don't get this deal, like all these things we worry about because they're known to us. They're at the top of our heads. We know these things. So they're easy to focus our attention and energy on. But to your point, you're much better using your energy thinking about what's the other party dealing with. Now, I will say, you could view that from both a collaborative and a competitive perspective, right? Like,
Sure.
If I'm negotiating with Andrew, I want to understand to the best of my ability, what are all the factors that are influencing Andrew's life right now, both from a positive and negative perspective, depending on the nature of the negotiation, right? If I know that Andrew's got a boss that's breathing down his neck to get a deal done under a certain timeline, there could be a circumstance where that's valuable information and I use that to my advantage, right? On the flip side of that, there could be a situation where we're trying to create some value in a deal, and me understanding Andrew's position and the unique objectives that he's trying to accomplish and his priorities, that's also valuable information, because I think one of the biggest impediments to successful deals in the corporate world, in the business world, is the fact that in most negotiations, both parties are never truly comfortable enough to share the information with the other party about what they actually need and what they actually want, right? Because, and it's normal, because if I share that, I feel like I'm exposing myself and I'm making myself vulnerable. So there needs to be certain levels of trust in order to have those levels of conversations and those quality of conversations. And unfortunately, those trust levels aren't often there. So what ends up happening in a lot of negotiations, we make assumptions, like you said, right? Like, what do I think Andrew wants? Well, I think he wants A, B, and C. So let's make Andrew an offer that looks like ABC. But if it turns out Andrew actually wanted X, Y, and Z, not ABC, then I'm just throwing spaghetti on the wall and hoping that it sticks, right? So by better understanding the other party's perspective, what they're coming into it with, what their objectives, priorities are, you can A, remove the emotion out of the situation, but B, craft a better proposal that appeals to what the other party is trying to accomplish and what's important to them. And that's how you make progress in a negotiation, right? And ultimately, that's how you can create value. Because if you care about XYZ and I care about ABC, well, let's create a deal where you get XYZ and I get ABC and we all walk away happy.
And I think that one of the key things there too, that the takeaway is that trying to understand the other person's position, what's important to them. Because, like Paul, I hear you talk about sometimes in terms of assigning value to certain things, right? You may be in possession of something that's of high value to the other party, but not of much value to you, right? And in a trade, in that scenario, you're accomplishing both of those. I mean, Andrew, have you seen that? Have you seen that the putting some thought into the other person's perspective, has that yielded better results?
Absolutely. I love what you just said, Paul, because that's sort of my proclivity towards negotiation strategies or tactics is, I have my levers that I want to pull, right? And they have their levers that they want to pull. And so, if I go into it and let's just say that my strategic priority as a business is to lock in long-term revenue, right? And this other party's interest is to drive down cost, right? They've got a CFO that's breathing down their neck, is like, get the best deal possible. Well, we can work together to make those two things fit, right? That's a very natural combination, as opposed to I'm coming into this and saying like, well, I need to maximize revenue with this contract with a very price sensitive customer. And if I don't understand that and I can't communicate around that, and we can't work together to, Paul, as you mentioned, fit, maybe it's C, D, and G that are the combination to get together. Like, if I don't empathize with them, I don't understand that. And what I found is we actually benefit and create better deals and closed opportunities as a team when we think like that and work like that, because we're getting at the core of negotiation, we're getting all the value pieces that we need, and I'm giving the customer what they perceive as valuable. And so, one, the deal looks amazing on my books because it's got everything that I want from a strategic standpoint. But two, I've reinforced trust with the customer, and now we have a long-term relationship, and we can build on that because they're like, this guy's not trying to screw me over. He's not one-sided in this deal, right? We get these fantastic outcomes, and it does things like, again, you want tangible results. You're talking about lengths of contracts, improving ACV, securing renewals, retention. Like, those are metrics that you can tangibly move with good negotiation tactics and really empathizing with your prospects.
So if I understood you right there, Andrew, I think I just heard that empathy and honesty, aside from being feel good, fluffy topics, are also statistically producing better outcomes, right?
We don't do anything without an ROI metric, right? We need the things that we do need to influence specific outcomes. Otherwise, right, what's the purpose? But yeah, absolutely. I could point to specific indicators in our business where approaching negotiation and our commercial process in general, and including empathy and honesty and having a good EQ and understanding our customer has dramatically improved revenue outcomes, retention outcomes, all of those key metrics that we're looking at from a business perspective.
Integrity and profitability. Paul, go ahead. I know you got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just want to build on that thought there. And you might be doing this already, but if not, I like to pepper in some little tips and tricks along the way too in these conversations. So, because one thing that you mentioned there, a big mistake that people make, in my opinion, in negotiation is when they create a proposal or they create an offer and they send it to the other party, it often reads like a shopping list of my wants and needs and desires. Like, I want this, 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 I want this. And it is often not positioned in a way that incentivizes the other party to agree to it or to even engage in it, because it reads, again, like a one-sided wish list. Yeah. Like, yeah, I want a high price. I want a long contract. I want short payment terms. I want, all of these things. It's like, well, yeah, I want a Ferrari and a Lamborghini in my driveway, but here we are. And so what my simple bit of advice for people is, when they're building offers or proposals, really lay it out bare and in clear language as far as what's in it for me and what's in it for you. And you can do this in some really simple ways, using some simple language like, okay, on the condition that you give me X, Y, and Z, then we'll agree to give you A, B, and C. And it doesn't have to be that language that's overly formal, but the idea and the concept of when you make proposals, you clearly lay out, this is what's in it for me, and I'm asking you for stuff. Like, let's be very clear. Like, yeah, I need stuff in this, but if you agree to this, I'm prepared to do this stuff for you as well. And inherently, it becomes so much more collaborative in a process, because, yeah, you're asking for stuff, but you're also giving stuff. And to your point, that's what builds relationships, and that's what makes people want to come back to deal with you again in the future. They're like, okay, I got to negotiate with Andrew again next year. You know what? Last year he was a pretty reasonable human being. I look forward to doing it again this year. So just simple little things like that. The way, even if it was the exact same variables in the same proposal, but just laid out in a slightly different way, can have a really big impact on our perception of the fairness of the proposal. So just some food for thought.
Stealing tactics from you, Paul. Making a few notes here. You may see my proposal structure change in the next couple of weeks, but I love it. No, but it is that. I mean, the perspective is so important. It's why we like to have. I mean, it's why we focus so much in sales on having, negotiation or deal conversations, and not in person, over Zoom or on a phone call, because I need to be able to read, the emotions in the room, and I need to be able to understand it. And I need to keep it from being so black and white of like, hey, you're going to pay me this much and it's this long and this is all this stuff you're giving me. We need to present it as an exchange for value. And I love this piece because I think that will resonate much better with a potential customer.
Let's talk for a minute, because it ties into when you talk about people creating that checklist, if you will, the checklist of what my needs are, right? Not thinking about yours. It seems to me, and I want to hear some thoughts on this, that oftentimes that strategy is not necessarily born from a desire to offend the other party. It's more born from, maybe parts of it are lack of knowledge. But one part of it I want to touch on here is, what about fear, Andrew? And when I talk about fear in negotiations, people are sometimes, just scared of confrontation. They're scared of being uncomfortable, right? And so I want to hear kind of what you've experienced with people who are fearful going in or in a negotiation, and what you've seen how you've seen that impact the outcome.
So I think that there are two parts to sort of resolving that or doing that better. One is a little bit unrelated to like the actual process of negotiation, but it leads into negotiation. If you don't do this well, you won't have a good conversation around securing a contract. And that really starts in the discovery process at the beginning of the sales conversation. And when we think about doing discovery, it's not about, hey, just what are your problems and challenges as they relate to my tools and my tech stack and what I want to sell you, but what are your challenges as an individual and as a team and as a business, and what are your bigger priorities? One, because it's going to allow you to create better opportunities, because if I can't align my tools with your strategic initiatives, I don't really have a shot at selling you anything. But two, it's going to allow me to understand more deeply your value drivers, where you have concerns, what are these problems that are going to be addressable, what is the value that I'm going to potentially bring to you. And those are all great pieces of knowledge to have going into a conversation and allow you to present, I think, things like proposals from a position, I don't want to say of strength, because it's not like you're trying to beat the other person, but I can craft something that's really useful to you as a customer. And that's what I want to think about, is I want to give you something that's actually relevant and useful, that because that's going to increase my likelihood of success and my likelihood of winning ultimately, right? I do agree with you too on the negotiation process. When you get later stage, oftentimes, I think it's a combination of things. I think one is people are scared of that confrontation. It's oftentimes why you see somebody go in and they're like, hey, here's your proposal, but I discounted it 20%. And it's, I'm throwing in all this stuff for free. And it's like,
just don't hate me.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, and then sometimes it's lack of alignment there's a multitude of things that could go into that, but I do think it's a fear of confrontation, and it's this fear of rejection. And I think it was, not to pull in all the cliche names, but, I need to make a deal that works for both sides. I need to do things that are supporting my initiatives as a business, and I want to help the customer. But in this scenario, it's okay to get to know. I think Chris Voss is the one who advocates of getting to know really quickly. As I'm name dropping, there's a multitude of people out there, but like, it's okay to get that rejection. And I think that comes from building trust within the teams to say, like, look, we're not going to get to a place that this is going to work. And the objective is not to do every deal possible, but it's to do deals or commitments or partnerships that are beneficial for both parties. That's where we want to get to. And so, being able to say, like, this doesn't work and I am okay walking with that, that's fine. But that, one, that needs to be a common practice, but two, that needs to be supported by leadership within the business.
And that's what I want to jump in here for a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
Please.
I've worked with thousands of frontline negotiators across the full breadth of the corporate world and in industries, every one that you could possibly imagine. And I think one of the most common challenges and things that people struggle with when you're on the front line is that bit of internal alignment around, I need to be comfortable that my boss has my back on this, right? And if this thing goes south, right, are we in alignment that, we agreed that this could happen, and obviously it's not great, but it happened and we're going to deal with it. And it is one of the single biggest things that holds people back in maximizing the value of their deals, is just that fear of, like, oh God, if I go in and I push for this and they tell me to go fly a kite and I lose the deal, then what happens, right? I'm the guy that lost, the big fish on the line. So can you speak to, and maybe now in your current role, how you handle that, or maybe how you've handled in the past, of gaining alignment with your sales teams, like to give them that confidence to go in and be like, hey guys, like, I don't want you to just bend over. To your point, 20% is instant discounts on the first proposal. I see you've sold SaaS before. Because
it's been offered that before. It's strange.
Yeah, it's once or twice, but yeah, how have you handled that in your current kind of role or past roles?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that go into it. One, it's really important for me as a leader to make sure that we are very transparent about our strategic objectives. What is important to us as a business, right? I talked about that earlier. Is it maximizing revenue? Is it locking in customers for long terms? Is it the ability to renew and retain customers? Are we trying to get product adoption? I know that those all things seem like, oh yeah, that's very obvious. But if the team is not clear on that and doesn't know what the business is focused on, then they can't effectively go to bat for those things and can't advocate for them. And you build a culture of people that are either one, sending out really poor proposals, or every 2 seconds they're like, what about this? What if I negotiate here? What if I, and it's, look, I don't mean to say that like you don't want to help teams, but to be effective at selling in general, you have to enable your frontline teams to negotiate effectively, and they need to know what's important in the business. I think the other thing is, if I'm coming into, if I'm getting questions from the team about a deal and how they should handle this and how, hey, they're pushing back on this. One, it's reiterating that, look, if this doesn't make sense for us, we're willing to walk from the deal always, right? It has to make sense on both ends. I know it, again, sounds very straightforward, but you have to continue to say that to your team. But it's also important to get their perspective on how they would approach this deal. So, before I'm giving my feedback, a lot of times I'm asking the team in response, well, what do you think based on your conversation with the customer? If you were in my shoes, what would you propose, right? Oftentimes they know the answer, but I think the repetition of empowerment for those teams is really critical, because it starts to steer them away from, well, I'm just going to ship general proposals, to let me think intelligently about this. And I have the confidence to know that like my manager trusts my decision-making process with these things, right? And then lastly, I'll say, I hate this, but I know it happens. There are deals all the time where the prospect just needs to hear it from somebody who's higher up in the organization. And I hate it, because I'm just like, look, these guys are doing all the work. I'm less important. But generally what I try to do with those conversations, because I know that they happen, is one, I'm like, look, I want to remind you that you've done everything right. You've done a great job. I'm going to go into that conversation and reinforce, for the most part, everything that my salesperson or my customer success person has said first, right? That's going to be our starting point. I'm not going to go in there and tear apart the deal and say, oh, just kidding, we'll give you this discount, right? Unless that person and myself have had a conversation about that, because it's, Paul, you mentioned this, it is incredibly important for my team to feel like what they're doing is correct, and I'm going to come in and support them and back them. So that is always our starting point, and I'll try to represent that same deal and get it across first, so that the rep, unless again for whatever reason it's atrociously misconstrued, no, we've talked about this, we're on the same page about this, I'm going to bat for you, and I'm going to stand behind the decisions you make. So that's kind of where I see improvements to be made in the process, and how we try to deal with it.
Yeah, and what I extracted from that is that, talking about that internal alignment, which is what negates a lot of that fear that we have. And one important component of that internal alignment that both Paul and Andrew shared is that feeling that you're all headed down the same goal, right? I mean, both of you on this call are leaders. And so hearing that that's a focus of, okay, let's get everybody focused in the same direction, that alleviates a lot of the fear. Am I understanding that right?
I mean, more so than fear, let's just be practical and honest about it. The last thing you want as a leader is to have to get involved in every single deal. Like it's a time suck. It destroys your people's confidence, right? And then you get helicoptered into every single deal, and your days just get evaporated dealing with other people's BS, part of my language. So,
no. Don't get Andrew started. Don't get Andrew started.
Freudian slip.
We've all been there, I'm sure, at points in our careers where we've had those bosses in our lives that have the egos that demand that they have the final say, and they get, they get to do the check mark exercise. But like, you think back on those people and those experiences, and you just must think like, how do these people get anything done on a day-to-day? Because they were just, they had their fingers in every single pot. Like, how are you effective at your job when you're trying to do everybody else's job? It's crazy.
Not possible. Not possible.
And the last thing I'll just say there too is the other problem with that, as a leader in any capacity, you don't know the details that the people boots on the ground know, right? You're coming in at 100,000 feet, and you're liable to do something or say something that can compromise a strategy or a position or a playbook that you're involved in. So there's a myriad of reasons as to why you as a leader don't want to be intimately involved in every single one of your people's deals. You would ideally want to be as far away as possible and empower them to do it.
One might argue as well that, I mean, if as a leader you have people that you feel you need to constantly be in their deals, that maybe isn't somebody who's right for your team, right? I mean, the concept is hire competent people, let them do their job, and that's how, because you have your own job to do. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, 100%. You build. I think it's interesting because if your goal is to build competence within a team, you actually do that by not helicopter managing them and stepping away from it, right? And giving them the power to make decisions and the autonomy to make decisions. And again, when I think about how to enable that, I set the precedent for the direction and that it's okay to fail and that there's a safety net there. And I continue to reinforce that, not by sitting in on, and listen, I don't want to misconstrue it like as leaders that we shouldn't assist our people. We should be open door. I should help them talk through these challenges. But Paul, I love what you said about you can go in and jettison and just completely destroy this deal because I haven't been working with this prospect. I don't have the relationship there. I have some seniority maybe, which is whatever, a falsehood maybe. But you can come in and nuke the whole deal because you're just like, oh, I'm going to change all these things, but I don't understand where they're coming from, who they are, what's important to them, right? Like that's a great point. People do that all the time. They don't know what happened. It's like, well, you stuck your finger into that, you shouldn't have. So,
Paul, do you have something you want to say about that?
Yeah, there's a line that I use sometimes when I'm working with clients. A little tongue in cheek. I say, oftentimes leaders have the authority to say yes and the ego that demands it. It's sometimes it feels good to be the boss, but it rarely works to your advantage in the deal itself.
Not good for the ego, but maybe not the optimal strategy for the outcome that we seek, right?
Yeah.
Andrew, you strike me as a guy who not only has a firm grasp of the technicalities and the sciences related to negotiation, but the art of it as well. And I want to touch on that for a minute. There's a couple of schools of thought. Some lean heavier than one versus the other, and some are 50-50. Negotiations as an art or as a science, where do you fall on that spectrum in terms of which one has more value or weight?
Well, first of all, I would say that I've hardly mastered it, but thank you for the kind words, Matt. Maybe
Yes,
I have a grasp on it. I do think that it's a little bit of both, right? I do think it's a little bit of both. And I don't mean to say that as a cop-out answer, because I think that you do need, again, I look at it very much like the entirety of the sales process. You need some structure, you need a framework, you need a set of principles where from to work, right? You can't be successful, you can't scale processes, you can't find repeatable success if you don't have a good framework for how you make decisions. However, I think that particularly with negotiations, there's such an emotional component, an emotional context to it, a highly variable context to it, that you have to be adaptable. And oftentimes there are considerations that can't be scripted, right? And I think about that. You see a similar argument in SaaS when this sort of product-led growth versus sales-led growth. And it's like, well, what's the value add from a sales perspective? And it's this nuance of I have practice at understanding and empathizing with an individual, and I can communicate adaptively with another human. Again, we're using a set of consistent principles from which to do that, which is that science, the repeatable processes or the repeatable decision-making criteria, but I can adapt that to the situation and be flexible enough and use my repetitions in talking to humans to adapt to different scenarios. So I do think it's both. I think you have to have good both in practice. You can't go totally scripted, but oftentimes you can't approach each conversation as unique and fly off the cuff everywhere. It's just you're not going to find repeatable success in that.
Fair enough. Paul, when you're working with clients and the Maker framework, what are you talking to folks about how to combine and marry, if you will, negotiations as both an art and a science?
It's not that different than what Andrew just mentioned. It's the science bit of it. I view as, to your point, it's the process. Are we doing something that's repeatable? Are we doing something that is clearly understood by the organization? Because I think a big area of opportunity for most organizations, big and small, is
Mhm.
you look at the function of negotiation and how we approach negotiation. There is no process in place. There is no science behind it. It is very ad hoc, right? Most organizations, and again, from the small to the very largest organizations out there, you can take a survey of 100 different salespeople in the organization and ask them how they go about negotiating their deals, and you will get 100 very different answers.
Wow.
It's not to say that any of them, again, are right or wrong. Maybe some of them are more effective than others. But the thing is, if there is no structure in place, if there is no expectations for like, hey, we're going to do step one, then we're going to do step two, then we're going to do step three, then a lot of it is just left to the individual, right? Like, I think historically negotiation's always been viewed as one of those skill sets that some people are just inherently better at than others, right? Like we all know people in our lives like, oh, I want to bring that person with me on the Saturday afternoon when I go and negotiate for that used car at the lot because they're gonna do me well. And then you've got those people in your life who you're like, I don't want them negotiating for a used toaster on a yard sale on a Saturday afternoon. They'll somehow figure out a way to pay double for what the person is asking, right? So, but in that sense, yeah, everybody's different. Everybody has their own unique skill sets and they're better at certain things than others. But it doesn't mean that everybody can't be good at negotiation. And in order for that to happen, you have to implement some sort of process through some sort of standardized structure. And it doesn't have to be completely rigid because that's where the art piece comes into it. But there needs to be some guardrails, some guidelines, some expectation from leadership of, okay, before you go negotiate a deal, we need to see A, B, and C happen. And I want to know what your thought process is, and we're going to lay it out and kind of come up with a game plan. And if we can do that, then you can start feeding in the art. Once you've got the foundation set of, okay, we know we're always going to do 1, 2, and 3 from a process perspective, but how we do 1, 2, and 3, that's the art piece. So that now we can start getting creative on it. But last thing I'll say is the expectation needs to be there internally that we're all kind of marching to the same tune at the very least for how we're going to approach a situation. Because if you don't do that, you're lost.
So creating that internal alignment, those guardrails, but then giving, some freedom and some license to go out there and be a little bit more creative and in that artistic space.
Yeah, I mean, listen, as they say, there's many ways to skin a cat.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know if that's politically correct. I don't know if you're allowed to say that anymore.
Who knows? Well, it probably is right now, but everything, changes in 5 minutes. Andrew, I want to get one last question for you before we hear a bit about what's going on over at User Voice and stuff, which is, in the movies, they portray negotiations to be fists pounding on tables and extreme emotions and all this drama. What would, in your experience, what do you think some of the biggest differences are in negotiations between movies and real life, what's actually happening?
It's an interesting portrayal because in a lot of ways it sort of mirrors the perception of salespeople in movies or theatrics, right? It's like we're wheeling and dealing, we're selling used cars or old toasters. We're out to get you. And, and I think, and honestly, I had that perception before I started my career in sales, and I've built a long career and it's not that, right?
Yep.
And I think it's the same way with negotiation. I mean, listen, I've been in, conversations that are stressful and difficult as part of a negotiation because there's so much at stake for both parties. But I actually find them to be quite the opposite. I feel like if you do them effectively, again, we're not always going to get to the outcome of, we have an agreement in place, but it doesn't have to be painful. Most of the time, the conversations are very amicable, especially if we're coming from a place of trust, especially for understanding, what's valuable to each party. And I'm empathizing and I'm doing a good job listening. I actually really enjoy them, right? Because I feel like it's an opportunity. Again, I'm getting to build trust with this person and build a deeper relationship with this person. But it also feels like, Paul, you've talked a lot about this. I'm exchanging value. Like I'm getting great stuff out of this conversation, but I'm giving you stuff as a buyer, as a customer. And that may sound cliche, but it's a very rewarding feeling, And so again, I'm not going to say that they're not always difficult, but I feel like they're much more balanced and much more amicable. If you have a good process, you really empathize with your customer, and you build that trust, they can be a blast.
Andrew, am I understanding you correctly that real life negotiations don't usually end in 5 minutes like the movies? They take.
I mean, unless you're, maybe you're doing hostage negotiation. I don't know. I haven't. That's one negotiation I have not yet been involved in, and hopefully don't get there.
Paul, there's another area for the Maker Group, hostage negotiation.
I'll leave that to Chris Voss. That's his area.
So, Paul, before we dive in and chat a little bit with Andrew more about user voice, do you have any thoughts on that? When you're training some of your folks out there in the field, some of your clients, about that relationship?
I mean, it's like Andrew said. It's not theatrics. It's not. We're not there to beat the other party up. I think to the uninitiated, negotiation seems like a me versus you thing, right?
Sure.
It seems like whatever I'm going to get's got to come at your expense and vice versa. So it's you see this when you work with people who are pretty new in their careers and pretty new in sales and are negotiating for the first time through no fault of their own, but they just don't have the perspective to really draw on. So they approach negotiation in a much more transactional kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
But I think through experience and through life, you realize, to Andrew's point, that we can trade value here. There's an opportunity for us to both come out on top. It doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean there's not going to be difficult conversations, and it doesn't mean it's always going to be like hunky-dory, kumbaya, hold hands and dance around the campfire saying yeah, I love everybody, right? It's not. You're going to have difficult conversations with your best customers. They're going to be hard. They're going to be uncomfortable. But if you treat people with respect and you treat people fairly and you come to it from a position of genuine understanding and empathy, then again, you'll get through those conversations. And in my experience, you come out the other side with a stronger relationship for it, rather than trying to, if I'm allowed to say, pussyfooting around things, rather than just trying to skirt the problem to begin with. Because then, you never really, the best relationships are the ones forged in fire sometimes. So you got to be, prepared to go through that.
And as sometimes people say, the mother of integrity is transparency, right? And so I think people can respect that, and they sense that when you're being real with them and being genuine. So that's some great feedback. So I want to first say, Andrew, that in looking at User Voice's website, one of my favorite things that I love is so many times in the tech world and SaaS space, a company will have a title, and that's okay, but it doesn't say what they do. My first thing when I was talking with Paul earlier, I'm like, hey, User Voice sounds like exactly what it looks like they do. So I'd love to open it up to you to chat a little bit about it looks like you've been there for a couple of years and talk more about what they do and kind of how they operate in that space.
Yeah. So I would say that User Voice is a product that's designed for product teams that really consider voice of customer as part of their development process, right?
Okay.
That's not everyone. That's not all product teams, but I would argue that the teams that scale the most effectively and build the best products put their customers at the center of their product, and we help enable them to do that. And a better parallel that I like to use is, oftentimes you look at product review sites or you look at product feedback channels, and how you'll see there's like 3 or 4 customers that are always screaming the loudest and like, I need this, I want this. I'm sure you guys have worked with those in the past. We try and help.
No comment.
Yeah, right. Everybody's like, I've never had that. We try to help circumvent that. What we really try to do is help product teams allow their customers to communicate with them through a multitude of channels to give relevant, meaningful feedback about the product. And then we try to take that feedback and contextualize it so the product team can look at it and prioritize it, right? I don't necessarily need to hear from the customer that's screaming the most. Maybe I want to prioritize product features for a new market segment. Maybe I'm trying to focus on retention. I need to build my product to make sure that, I keep the majority of my customers. We want teams to be able, as part of their prioritization process, to align the feedback and voice of the customer with their strategic initiatives. And so they can build for more effective outcomes. They can influence retention. They can influence net new business. They can actually tie product development and product iteration to meaningful outcomes. And so we've been at that for, I think, close to 14 years now. It's been an interesting iteration from, trying to perpetuate feedback to trying to enrich it. And I think the next phase of where we're going, all this is not totally concrete yet, but we want to start to, if I'm getting a lot of feedback, we want to detect, we want to infer themes, we want to understand what the feedback more holistically is telling us. And again, just to make it more actionable, digestible, and relevant to a business in general.
So tapping into a bit of your hospitality background, right? If I'm understanding right. So we're kind of listening to what the customers are saying, maybe at this point, categorizing their thoughts to be able to give that specific data to the company that they're looking for. Am I close?
Yeah, that's a perfect summary of it. I want that feedback to have meaning. I want it to be relative. And I want to tie it to product initiatives, business initiatives, so that, I'm not building I think oftentimes teams can build in a vacuum, whether they're not listening to the customer or they are not iterating based on the appropriate feedback from the appropriate customer. And so we're trying to enable you to do those things. There's a lot of tools out there that can help you collect feedback, can help you get reviews, can help you tell how to change your product. But really, from our perspective, the value is saying, okay, we'll open up the channels, we'll get a lot of it, but we're going to show you the stuff that's most meaningful, and we're going to tell you what to do to action it, to actually make an impact that's positive to your broader business.
Well, the parallel that I hear there too with us is that, like, in the same way we talk about negotiations as sometimes big, as Paul pointed out, huge corporations are just kind of doing it, right? Like they don't even know what they're doing. There's no process. There's no strategic reason they're doing it. They're just winging it.
Yep.
It sounds like you aim to prevent that as well from teams working inside of a vacuum, just winging it, right? I got a customer feedback here. It might have no relevance to what you're working on, but you guys are trying to categorize that. So it sounds like an amazing product. And the name of that is User Voice, and it's actually uservoice.com. So nothing complicated there. Very straightforward. Great looking website, by the way.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Paul, before we wrap up, do you have anything else that you want to add?
No, I mean, I enjoyed the conversation. I learned a lot. I think, to give you guys a little bit more of a plug there, User Voice, to me right now, given the environment that we're in, given the challenging economic environment, I think there's nothing more important than delivering a product that delivers on what your customers want. And like outside of User Voice, like outside of just in general, because we are both consumers of SaaS products and we have our own SaaS products, so I can fully appreciate the problem that you're trying to solve there, because there is nothing more frustrating than bad software. And again, in this, let's be honest, we're heading into uncertain times. I think everybody's tightening their belt a little bit, so every dollar you invest in development, in product feature development, whatever it is, it's got to count. It's got to land. There's very little room for error these days. So I think I think it's a great thing that more people should take advantage of.
Well, and in parallel to that, I think what y'all are doing, not to start to conflate everybody's egos, but no. I think this is such an important part. Negotiation is such an important part of the commercial process. And I think in my perspective, oftentimes one that's sort of underutilized, and where, to your point, Paul, we're now in a market where I can't afford to just throw out general proposals or have, sort of non-scalable, non-repeatable, non-effective processes that I can't coach on. I don't have the lead gen. I don't have the pipeline, the deal velocity that I did 2 years ago. It's really important for me to retain deals. And how do I do that? I empathize with customers. I trust that, or they build trust with them. And I exchange value in this negotiation process. And so the fact that y'all are helping coach teams through that and organizations through that is, in my perspective, hugely invaluable. So hats off to you guys.
Oh yeah, thanks. And we enjoy it too. And both of you here, as we wrap up, both of you have made comments about learning from the other person. And imagine being me here. And this, part of this podcast is fun, getting to, meet new people. But I get an education every time. So you guys learn something. I learned like 12 truckloads of things. So thank you both for that. I really appreciate it. So with that being said, unless either one of you have anything else to add, it's been a true pleasure, Andrew, to have you here. And we hope to do it again very soon. So any closing thoughts from anybody, or are we good?
I'm good. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you guys very much for doing this. I had a blast. I learned a lot as well. So thank you for making the time.
Cool. Absolutely. Our pleasure.